you are actually hungover?
Hello.
How many are only here because you want to get out of the rain? Oh, I love you all. Thank you so much for coming. I know that this clashes with the charity auction and that's a big draw, so I'm super appreciative of everyone coming along. Who has been to one of the Minamis where I've done a similar kind of talk? Cool.
Is this Amecon?
Sorry?
Did you do it? Oh, no, that was fine.
I did a panel at Amecon, but it was about memes.
Yes, that's it.
Yeah, no, this is, last two Minamis I've done panels about my research into anime fandom in the UK. So thank you very much for coming. I was a bit worried that this would be retreading a lot of familiar territory for a lot of people because it's a lot of the same stuff that was at Minami, so I'm really glad that this is going to be new for a lot of you. So anyway, yes, this is Fascinating Fandom, the detailed demographics of UK anime fans. So just a quick thing about me. I'm an MPhil candidate at Sci-Fi University. I'm a long-time cosplayer and convention attendee, over 20 years. I'm a third Q Naganatica. If anyone actually saw me in the raid yesterday or came to mine and my partner's Naginata panel yesterday, thank you very much. Nerd! The photo was taken in Haneda Airport when we were en route to Singapore, we landed. It was, it was a long wait for the connection. We were both very tired. We hadn't had much sleep on the plane, and I saw the shot that had the Gundam model in it. I just charged at it to take a selfie. So the other thing that I'd say with this is, hopefully there'll be time for Q&A at the end. I'd rather that if anyone does have any questions, please keep them to the end. If we don't get time, then just come and speak to me. I'm, in general, quite friendly. So anyway, about the research. So my MPhil is specifically about anime fandom in the UK. There's not been a whole lot written about UK anime fandom. There's a lot about American fandom, obviously, because they are huge. Australian fandom, because also they are huge. And Japanese fandom, obviously, as well. But very little about the UK. And very little formally written about the UK, anyway. And I figured I may as well fill that gap. So this is my thesis title. Anime in the UK, the development and evolution of anime fandom in the UK and the move towards transnational fandom through cultural globalization. Which sounds probably maybe very complicated, but it's pretty simple. It's just, we started very small and very self-contained, but through things like the internet and easier modes of communication, we've become very spread out and transnational in the way that it's very easy now to interact with fans all over the world because of the internet and internet communities. And it's had a little bit of a knock-on effect in the way that we run here. So the central question is, how did anime fandom in the UK arise and how has it evolved in response to technological and social shifts? So I'm not going to be covering all of that today because that's a lot. I will give a link at the end, but something that I have done as part of my research is to build up a timeline of the key events in UK anime fandom, all the way from when Marine Boy first aired on TV up to present day. It's pretty comprehensive at the moment, but if anyone wants to have a look at it, if there's anything that you remember happening that seems significant that I don't have on there, please do let me know because I want to make it as full and complete as possible. So, what I'm going to talk about is my demographic research. So what I wanted to do was to get a good, clear picture of the makeup of UK anime fandom today. Because obviously I've been around for a long time, I've seen how it's changed. And I remember when it was very much a male-dominated thing. When you went to a convention, it was mostly men. And I've seen how it has shifted and how much more equal it has become in more recent years. But I wanted to get a solid quantitative idea of that. Through that as well, then I could examine demographic shifts across the history of anime in the UK and determine where generational lines can be drawn using the data retrieved. I'll come back to the generations towards the end because that's a slightly different thing. But so the way I did this was I ran a questionnaire which ran from March of 2016 to February of 2017. So for a full year I was taking responses on this. I asked respondents about their demographic information, age, gender identity, sexual orientation, levels of education, and whether or not they identified as transgender. Then things like their first experiences of anime, which were their first cons, I call these entry points, and the things about anime and anime fandom that interest them most. I promoted it through a flyer which was in the con bags in Minamicon, Kitacon and Amecon all through that year. Did anyone see those? Did anyone actually take part in this questionnaire? Yeah. Oh good, cool. It was shared through Facebook eventually to boost the numbers because I was resisting putting it online simply because I didn't want to risk, because of the nature of the internet, I didn't want to risk having a lot of people who were in other countries participating, because I really wanted to focus on UK-based fandom. But I shared it on Facebook eventually, and several of my friends shared it around as well, and that really boosted the numbers. So in the end I had 256 responses, 197 of which were completed. It was 3 pages and some people didn't make it all the way to the end. So the results. Quick rundown of the overall results. So respondents were largely male, 49.2%, predominantly white, 91.4%, predominantly did not identify as transgender, 95.3%. I'm specifically saying that they did not identify as transgender rather than saying that they were cisgender, because you can be non-binary and not be transgender, so I'm choosing my words carefully there. Predominantly heterosexual, 57.4%, and predominantly aged between 25 and 34 years old, which a lot of that didn't really surprise me terribly much. However, oh yes, most popular anime series. The most popular overall was Cowboy Bebop. If you look at the rest of the list, it's all actually relatively old things. I think what's the newest thing on there? Either Madoka or FNA Brotherhood, I think. Does that sound right? Yeah. So yeah, it was actually sort of fairly classic things. I postulated that this was probably more to do with the fact that the newer things which have been very popular just haven't had time to have the same kind of traction that something like Cowboy Bebop or Evangelion have had. I mean, I only had 2 people who listed, because it was a top 5 anime series, I only had, I think, 2 people who said Yuri on Ice, which surprised me because that's been so popular. But it was because when this started running, it had only just recently started airing, pretty much. So yeah, I think if I ever run this again, that will probably be placed a lot higher because the fandom is enormous for that. So far, so stereotypical. So, stereotypes. Basically, to make this a little bit different from what I did at Minami, I'm just going to go through some stereotypes about us as fans and see how those are supported or rejected by the data. So, firstly, these spaces are for men. Male-dominated, and women are rare within them. Do we think this was true or false based on the data? False. Very false. So, although men make up a large proportion of fans, women and people of other genders are by no means rare. I do remember going to cons where there were very, very few women, and the story that I like to tell is sitting in the reception area at Minami, I think it was about Minami 6, back when they used to print the names in the con book of people who were attending, and sitting with some friends and counting up how many women were on the list and how many men were named Chris. And there were more men named Chris than there were women. There's a very noticeable shift, and I mean, you don't even really need to take the data, I think, probably, to just instinctively know it's much more balanced now. Among the younger age groups, there was a female majority, in fact. Among 18 to 24s, it was 44.74% female, and 51.55% among 25 to 29-year-olds. Non-binary and other gender identities were also very well represented among younger age groups, 21.05% among 18 to 24s and 9.28% among 25 to 29s. And a third of respondents aged 35 to 39 identified as non-binary. Stereotype, geeks are mainly heterosexual. True or false? How many for true? How many for false? True, but although the respondents in most age groups mainly straight, only 2 age groups reported no other sexual orientations, 45 to 49-year-olds and 50-pluses. One thing I will say, and that's something I'll come back to, is that the data pools for those 2 age groups were quite small. So it's entirely possible and possibly even likely that they're not very representative. But nonetheless, it was a sort of stark drop-off. 19.9% of respondents overall were bisexual. That's the second largest group of sexual orientations. And 9.4% were asexual, which was the third largest group. Straight people were only the second largest group among 18 to 24s. 34.21% were straight, compared to 36.84% who identified as bisexual. And the big surprise actually with this was how few gay or lesbians there were, according to the data, only 3.5%. I think that's, again, if it was a bigger pool, I think that would be a bit different. But it was just something that really surprised me as I was going through the data. Transgender people did make up a minority of respondents, 3.9% overall. However, according to the Gender Identity Research and Education Society, the estimated proportion of the UK population that identifies as transgender is only 1%. So that's a good bit higher within our makeup. And in fact, when you go into some of the specific age groups, 25 to 29-year-olds is 5.15%, and among 18 to 24 is 7.89%, which is a very high number compared to the national average, which I thought was really interesting. Stereotype, geeks are mainly white. True? Yes, but although age groups are mainly white, the younger groups return a much greater degree of diversity. 25 to 29-year-olds reported 5.15% were mixed race. And within the 25 to 29s, there were East Asians, Southeast Asians, African and Caribbean black people, and Roma and Irish traveller, which surprised me. Also, overall, the second largest ethnic group was mixed race. Admittedly, it's 4.3%, it's not a huge number, but nonetheless, it's a... I guess I was surprised that it was that one rather than one of the other ones. Stereotype, geeks are insular and antisocial. Who thinks this is true? Yeah. Very false. So it's not just that Amecons in the UK are so big now and the demand to get into them is so high. I mean, we know how fast Petercom sells out. I'm sure most of us probably experienced the hassle of trying to get rooms here this time around. And anyone who has gone to Minami for a long time knows that it's better to sign up for next year's Minami on the last day of the previous year's, rather than waiting for them to actually open the registrations online and battle for the last 15 places. But it goes beyond that. So every age group reported being introduced to anime through friends and family. 28.57% of 18 to 24s reported that this was how they discovered anime. Many users between 25 and 39 years old also reported having been members of university clubs, very specifically in those age groups. So I don't, is there anyone who's younger than that? Do university clubs still exist? They do? Okay, cool. Because, yeah, I don't think very many people under this age reported them. But the other thing that was really interesting was that every age group up to the age of 39 said that one of their favourite things about anime and anime fandom was the sense of community that is fostered within cons. And I mean, it's something that spreads out online. Anyone that's in the social groups for Amecon, people have been really supportive of each other over the weekend, reporting lost items and being supportive and passing on good wishes. So we're actually very supportive. Not to say that there are not awful people. But in general, we are a very friendly and actually quite open fandom, which is wonderful. Stereotype, anime fans are all into very sexual and or violent titles. Is that resoundingly false? Yes. How many people remember what anime fandom was like in the 90s? Okay. Right. I think this is something which is, it definitely took great hold in the 90s, and it sort of persists, even though it has no particular reason to do so. The issue in the 90s was that all we really had in the 90s for video releases, pretty much, the big company was Manga Video. And Manga had made a conscious choice, because I think they'd grown out of a music company, and they made a very conscious choice that they were going to target their releases at young men aged between 18 and 25, I think it was. And the guy who was running it at the time basically interpreted this as being blood and sex. And this is why all the early Manga Video titles, it was things like Akira and Fist of the North Star and Urotsuki Doji came out and did none of us any favours. I remember being a teenage anime fan, and this wasn't even in England. This was in Ireland, where people really didn't know any better, and being surrounded by my classmates being all like, "Oh, that stuff's all violent and gross and sexy," and I was like, "It's really not," because I was watching Totoro and Gunbuster, and these are very nice things. So yes, this is absolutely not true. The list that was posted earlier was a lot of action series, but 3 of the most popular series overall were Cardcaptor Sakura, Azumanga Daioh, and Sailor Moon, none of which I think anyone could with a clear conscience describe as overly sexual or violent. The older age groups, so 35 and older in particular, were more likely to cite cuter or less action-orientated anime among their favourites, such as Tenchi Muyo, Escaflowne, or Urusei Yatsura. I think that, because that's my age group, I think we're the ones that most acutely remember what it was like in the 90s and have pushed back against it a lot. People who were in the younger age groups who were coming in, when it was easier to get things through the internet and when there were other companies releasing softer material, haven't had to push back in the same way that we did in the 90s. Yeah, this is interesting because these were the people who would have been most exposed to early days manga video releases. Looking at the top anime movies, Studio Ghibli films are consistently the most popular across almost all the age groups. And other consistently popular films include The Girl Who Leapt Through Time, Summer Wars, and Paprika. Again, all of which are quite sweet films. Okay, which one are you groaning about? Paprika. Here's the thing, right? There's some harsh stuff in Paprika, but Satoshi Kon just has such a great sense of the otherworldly that it feels... It's not his sweetest film by any means, definitely, but I don't feel like there would have been as much controversy about Paprika if it came out in the 90s as there were some of the other things that came out in the 90s. Because at least there's no tentacle rape in it. I know which scene you're thinking of, and yeah, but... Stereotype, men are curators, women are creators. So this is a thing that gets repeated across a lot of fandoms, that one of the core differences between the way male fans consume things and the way female fans consume things is that men are more likely to collect things and to have collections that are carefully maintained and are sort of, the artifacts are given value in that way. Whereas women are more likely to take the fandom, run with it, and make their own things. So through things like cosplay, fan art, doujinshi, and craft materials. There are a lot of people in the dealer's room who are selling their own original crafts now. So what do we think? Does that sound like it might be true or false for Amecon?
I'd say true-ish at most, like it leans in that direction. But
it's actually quite true according to the data. So, male respondents consistently reported rarely or never participating in writing fanfiction, producing fan art, making AMVs, or producing other craft items. While there was more variety for cosplay, only 8.2% reported cosplaying very often. Female respondents were far more engaged with all activities apart from making AMVs. 26.5% reported cosplaying very often, and 6.9% wrote fanfiction very often. People who were non-binary or other genders were most engaged, particularly with cosplay. 50% of non-binary people and 60% of people of other genders reported cosplaying very often. I can imagine that being because cosplay allows you more freedom to kind of play with, particularly with notions of gender. Also, a little plug for all the cosplay that I've done over the years. Stereotype. Creative engagement is for young people. True, but 18 to 24s were most likely to report cosplaying very often, so 32.1%. 25 to 29-year-olds were most likely to report writing fanfiction or producing fan art very often, so 6.9% and 11.1% respectively. Respondents aged between 40 and 49 largely did not participate in creative activities or only did so rarely. However, respondents aged 50 plus were more varied, with some respondents reporting cosplaying fairly often, producing fan art very often, and other craft items very often. Also just as evidence that creativity is not a young person's game, behold the wonder that is Auntie Shirley. She is a Singaporean cosplayer, she is 70 years old. She's cosplayed as Supergirl, as you can see, she's done Chun-Li. She's fabulous, and she's I gather, a regular appearance at Singaporean Comic-Cons and Amecons. Goals, life goals. Because she's wonderful. Right, fan generation. So this is what I mentioned earlier, and I'll just sort of go back to it now. So Hiroki Azuma wrote a book called Otaku, Japan's Database Animals, which is about, obviously, Japanese otaku culture. In it, he identifies 3 generations of fans, and again, this is Japanese otaku. So the first generation was born around 1960, introduced to anime through Space Battleship Yamato and Mobile Suit Gundam in their teenage years, interested in sci-fi and B-movies, and were the shapers of otaku culture. The second generation was born around 1970. The inheritors and benefactors of otaku culture that was developed by the first generation. So basically they came into it and helped to form it even greater than what it was at the time. The third generation was born around 1980, introduced to anime through Neon Genesis Evangelion in their teenage years, interested in mysteries and video games, more internet-based fandom, and greater interest in computer graphics as opposed to traditional illustration. So the issue with that I find when I read it is, I thought a lot of it sounded like it was actually quite similar to my experience of anime fandom, you know, sort of coming up through UK anime fandom. But it was in 2001, so by the time I was reading this, it was about 2012, so it was a decade out of date at that point, and I thought, surely that can be expanded on. So I actually did come up with a proposal for a fourth generation, which I put to people at Amecon in 2012. Did anyone go to that one? Who was actually at Amecon 2012? Okay, good for you. I can't remember all the specifics of it because I don't have it on one of these slides here, but one of the things I postulated about it was that the fourth generation was sort of, you know, put it another 10 years later, so born in the 90s, and that they weren't really ashamed of being anime fans in the way that some of us older ones were, and they didn't have the instinct to sort of keep quiet about it and hide the power level, and were much more likely to incorporate it into their other fandoms and other things that they were interested in. I asked the room of people there, several of whom would have fitted into this, if they felt that that was accurate, and they all sort of went, nah, not really. So it was this sort of interesting thing where a lot of them kind of said that they still had the kind of shyness about talking about themselves as anime fans and being into anime. I had also very foolishly speculated that they maybe didn't remember what it was like before we had the internet, and they all went, of course we did, no. I'm sorry. Anyway, so since that didn't look accurate, and I had a few other ideas about, you know, where that could go to make it a bit more accurate, but I thought using this research I could possibly draw some more accurate lines and find the generation divides that way. So, first UK generation based on my research, born in the early 60s to mid-70s. First exposure to anime was Marine Boy on television. I think pretty much everyone who was in the older age groups cited their first experience of anime was watching Marine Boy on TV. Anime is an extension of an interest in sci-fi, and they probably considered themselves primarily sci-fi fans. Got involved in early anime fandom through Anime UK and may have been at EasterCon in 1990. EasterCon in 1990 is considered to be the point at which UK anime fandom exploded. There was a 24-hour anime stream which was curated by Helen McCarthy at that con, and from that the Anime UK newsletter, as it was, kind of developed. Anime UK newsletter then turned into Anime UK magazine, eventually turned into Anime FX magazine, sadly closed, but it was the beginning of everything. And a lot of early days anime fans were reading Anime UK / Anime FX. And the people who were involved in it went on to other things and remained sort of recognisable names. Possibly not so much now, but definitely in the 90s people knew Helen McCarthy, Steve Kite, Will Overton. These were people who were heavily involved in Anime UK and then went on to have involvement in Manga Mania, which then became Manga Max, and also Superplay magazine, which was a Nintendo games magazine, but which had very heavy anime content because Helen and Will were involved in it. Second UK generation, born in the mid-70s to early 80s. First exposure to anime through hybrid cartoons of the 80s like Battle of the Planets, Mysterious Cities of Gold and Ulysses 31. Who remembers those?
Yep.
Of course you do. We all do. They were good times. Interest later reinforced by early manga video releases, particularly those aired in art slots on BBC Two or the Channel 4 late license, which ran in the late 90s. Technology is a key related interest, particularly video games. So, third UK generation, born mid to late 80s, the beginnings of the Pokemon generation, though we're just as likely to see late night TV screenings as they were to see anime on kids' TV shows, so Cardcaptor Sakura and Dragon Ball Z were also around. Their interest reinforced by the relatively major cinematic release of Ghost in the Shell and or the Academy Award given to Spirited Away. I do remember Spirited Away, like, when that came out, that was kind of like the big push for Ghibli. I mean, I know that a lot went into bringing Princess Mononoke to Western cinemas, but it really wasn't until Spirited Away that things got a big push, because I think the Academy Award gained a lot of attention. Obviously, we already knew about Studio Ghibli, but suddenly everyone else, all the film people, were aware of it. And there was a whole lot of effort went into bringing that to cinemas. You could choose to see it subbed or dubbed, which was incredible. And the fourth generation, born in the early 90s onward, very definitively introduced to anime through Pokemon and general mainstream exposure through other cartoons, dedicated TV channels, and large events like MCM Comic-Con and Japanese-style video games. So anime got cool, and I think as well that was, you know, because of the internet and because people were more aware of things and because of shifts in general, it was a kind of feedback loop. It's more popular, we start feeding more, oh, it becomes more popular. Very social, possibly even to the extent of considering the fandom more important than the medium. A few people did actually say that in my research, that they're not actually so interested in anime as a medium, but they really like cosplaying and spending time with their friends and just kind of coming and hanging out to this, especially because big events like this, you see people at these cons that you live at the other side of the country, and you can talk to them online, but you don't get to see each other very often because you live so far apart. And that social aspect of it, that actually goes right back to the early days of Amecons in the UK. The only real difference was that we had to stay in contact with people by writing letters or phoning, you know. But I mean, like the excitement of going to a con and knowing that people that you never get to see except for Amecons is something that persists through to today. And particularly in the younger people, that was something that they really enjoyed. Beyond, many long-time fans have married, started having children, and are introducing them to anime and conventions. My friend Jenna, possibly her daughter holds the record for being the youngest ever con attendee, having gone to Minamicon when she was 6 days old. I was talking to her about this a couple of days ago, and she said, yeah, probably no one's ever going to break that record. I went, well, unless someone literally gives birth at a con. Please don't give birth at a con, it's a terrible idea.
I'm thinking people are now trying to figure out how to time it.
Yeah, it's also worth noting, people who were born in 2000 are turning 18 this year. Seeing as how most conventions in the UK, with the exception of Minamicon and obviously things like MCM, which are more like trade fairs, they tend to have a minimum age limit of 18 for insurance reasons, and that means we're going to start seeing more new people coming through to these because they're not old enough to do it. So we should be able to observe new generations coming up soon. I may repeat this data one day just to get a comparison. I'm not going to do it imminently, but yeah. When I did this panel at Minami, someone quipped that, you know, because I'd said a lot of people had said, you know, being introduced to anime through friends and family. And for the most part, it was cousins and, you know, friends of my own age. And for some of the older people, it was my son or my nephew, or, you know, some other younger family member said, hey, look at this. And someone said, does that mean that, you know, if you run this again in 10 years' time, are you going to get people saying, I got into anime because my parents made me? Yeah, and again, you know, Jenna's not here, so I can talk about her all I want. She, her daughter is fully entrenched in anime. She watches Cardcaptor Sakura and Pokemon, and she loves them. And she's also been introduced to Yuri on Ice. Because the feeling was that there's nothing terribly inappropriate for a 4-year-old in it. I haven't seen it, so I cannot comment, but there you go. So, problems. What's wrong with my data? So I already touched on this first one. The sample size is quite small. So I was happy to get over the 200 mark. I would have been happier if I'd gotten over the 200 mark for completed surveys, but nonetheless, it was quite a small sample size considering that the maximum capacity of Amecon is 1,500, and the number of people that go to MCM is huge. There's some loss of accuracy due to questions requiring respondent interpretation, judgment, or memory. Quite a few people, because I asked what was your first anime convention, and quite a few people couldn't exactly remember. And I mean, for a lot of the time, the people who couldn't really remember were people who had been to MCM or to you know, LFCC or one of the other sort of identikit Comic-Cons, which really don't vary very much from year to year. And things like, you know, how often do you cosplay? I felt a little bit bad afterwards because people pointed this out. It was kind of hard to judge whether, well, I make one costume per con. Is that very often? That's not as often as someone who makes 6 costumes per con, but it's more than someone who makes one per year, or more than someone who, you know, just buys a costume because they're going to an MCM and they just want to hang out for the day. So where do you put yourself on that continuum? And so that is a problem with it. It possibly skews the data. A phrase that I heard many years ago, which has stuck with me: surveys are a great way of finding out about people who like filling out surveys. I tried to keep the survey as short as possible so that it wouldn't be too onerous for people. Unfortunately, because of the type of data I needed to collect, it was 3 pages. Like I say, not everyone got to it. There was one person who I think just sort of gave up halfway through, but decided rather than just stop doing the questionnaire, just started filling out stupid answers. And fortunately, it was only one person, so I was able to just go delete. But yeah, it was like about halfway through, he just sort of wrote, "This is a very long survey," and I was like, "I'm sorry." You don't have to keep going. Also, high numbers of university graduates in results may be due to researcher sympathy. So something I haven't covered in this one is that, for the most part, we are very well educated. Most people had bachelor's or master's degrees. There were some people who were still at A-levels, but I think they were mostly in the much younger groups and therefore haven't completed degrees yet. And then there were a handful of people who were beyond. But for the most part, it was bachelor's and master's, which is, to be fair, I think what most people do in society. But someone pointed out to me that demand characteristics are a thing. Demand characteristics are where you complete a questionnaire rather than completing it completely honestly. You do it in a way that you think the researcher wants to hear. And I don't think I pitched any questions in that way, but it was pointed out to me that when it was being shared around on Facebook in particular, the angle that a lot of people took was, "My friend is doing an MPhil and she's doing this research, it's really hard to get responses, please help her out." And so possibly a lot of the people who saw that were like, "Oh yes, I remember doing that, I will help my fellow postgraduate," because I've done that too, and I think probably a lot of us do. So takeaways from this. External factors have been a major catalyst for change, such as technological developments, shifts in social norms, etc. This is probably not in the least bit surprising to anyone, and I think very heavily of the internet because it has brought so many things close together. It has made so many things easier and more accessible. Something again that I've not really covered in this is about sort of inter-fan debates. There are discussions about particularly problematic behaviour and interpretations of texts which get shared around by people from lots of different perspectives from all over the world. And if you're on Tumblr, you'll see this a lot because that's what Tumblr's like. Lots of discussion about representation and interpretations and coding, which are discussions that weren't so easily shared in the early days. And then as well, just things have changed in society. There are some things which are just more acceptable. It is in fact very difficult to get an 18 certificate from the BBFC now, to the point where a lot of video distributors almost consider it a badge of honour to get an 18 certificate from the BBFC. But anyone who remembers what BBFC was like with anime in the 90s remembers that they cut and slashed heavily, and there were 18 certificates all over the place and you weren't even getting the full thing. So that has changed so much, and it's because so much has changed about the expectations of society and what people deem acceptable. The youngest fans are the ones bringing in the biggest changes. This is very obvious. This is what happens. It comes up through the youth. They're also part of the reason why stereotypes are being increasingly untrue. There are some things which are still borne out by the data, obviously, as you've seen, but I mean, your instincts for a lot of them were, no, that's not true. Things are changing. Despite the many differences across generations, we still all have a lot in common. Everyone loves Japanese food. One of the things I asked, what are some of your favourite things about, Japanese culture that aren't anime and manga? And so many people were like, the food or the drink, consistently popular across them all. And again, it was, the fact that so many of us got into it because of knowing other people who already knew about it. And so many of our behaviours are very similar. So that's all I have to say. If anyone is interested in seeing my timeline, that is the link at the bottom there. I can make these slides available for anyone who wants to have a better look at these. I don't know how well it will work on mobile, that link, because I've not tested it, but it works fantastically on desktop. And also, yes, that's my Twitter on the top, which I don't use for very much, but I do pick it up, and my email address. So, I still have loads of time, so does anyone have any questions or comments? Yes?
So, you talked about defining generations using the data. I'm assuming you invoked some sort of mathematical analysis to cluster or group your respondents and see if there was some sort of age clustering. What exactly? How did you go about that?
Okay, so I had separated the respondents into age groups 5 years apart. So it was I only had one person who was under 18, but then it was 18 to 24, 25 to 29, 30 to 34, etc., up to 50 plus. So looking within those, it was a case of literally numerically just seeing what were the most popular things and looking for where the similarities lay. And sometimes you could see sort of flows from one to the next, but for the most part it was looking at sort of averages and means, using those 5-year brackets, and then seeing where you started to lose a trend and something else began to take over. So that's basically how that was done. Yes?
First of all, I want to say thank you for this research, because I remember 6 years ago I was at uni and I studied events management, and for my marketing module I wanted to write about conventions. I found it really hard to find like anything to back my paper up. So in the end I went to NHK World, they do J Mello, and each year they do a survey which is about Japanese music, so at least, and they release their survey, so at least I could get demographics, what kind of people listen to Japanese music, and I kind of cheated and used that data.
Yeah. Was that for Japanese users though, or was that?
It's worldwide.
Oh, it's worldwide.
It's a worldwide survey, and I'm very grateful that they released their data after analysing it. It's really helpful, so if you wanted to check that out.
Okay.
But yeah, so yeah, I'm grateful for that, and I would have also been interested in taking part in the survey, but I live further north, I live in Yorkshire, and I get a feeling that if you're in like cons or if you don't get that reach within the entirety of the UK, so I don't know if it would be possible to just like where you're from, and then if anybody answers out of the UK, you can disregard those.
Well, I mean, the handy thing with the survey software that I used was that it collected IP addresses and showed where they were from, so I could easily filter out anyone who posted that wasn't from the UK. There was only one person, I think, who filled it in mistakenly, and then it was just, well, sorry. I mean, I wanted to limit the pool a bit, because as I say, I wanted to try not to let it spread out beyond the UK and just make it more complicated than it needed to be, because I especially didn't want to have a lot of data which I then had to cut and have much less data. But I mean, the other thing was, early on I had decided that I wanted to get a picture of what I termed active fans, and because watching anime series on Netflix requires almost no effort, but if you come to a convention you have to book your time off, arrange your travel, arrange your accommodation. If you're cosplaying, you have to make your cosplays. If you're doing a panel, you've got to do your slides and everything. There's a lot that goes into participating in fandom in this way, and that was the social group that I wanted to get. So that was why initially I only focused on promoting it through conventions. I came to realise that wasn't a great way of doing it. My supervisor even said, really? Yes. If I ever do revisit this research, I'll find a better way of doing it, and a better way of sharing it out, because, like I say, I'm very aware that the data pool was good for what I wanted to do, but it was still small compared to what the fandom is. So if I ever revisit it, and I may very well do, because it's been suggested to me that I should write this up into a book after my thesis is written, because there is no written complete history, or mostly complete history of UK anime fandom, and because so much of my thesis is going to focus on that, it will translate very well into a book.
And like you said, it would flow into help other industries,
Yeah.
like events management, marketing, everybody who's now growing up and looking jobs,
Yeah.
hopefully with something they're interested in that would help them.
Yeah.
I feel it would help.
One thing I will say, if you are doing any kind of research project about how Amecons in the UK operate, just get in touch with the committee. They are very happy to oblige. I've had a member of the committee from Minamicon, after I did my first talk about this 2 Minamis ago, come up to me afterwards and said, would it help if I sent you some information about the gender divide at Minamicon? And I was like, that would be brilliant, and he just sent me over a spreadsheet. So they're very happy to help, because the cons are small enough. And what are you laughing at?
Data protection.
GDPR.
Oh yes, GDPR.
It's anonymous data.
Well, no, even with anonymous data, GDPR, generally speaking, you can only use it for purposes that people gain permission to have it collected for.
Yeah.
So if you share it, I think you have to have previous permission to share it for that purpose, although not necessarily for the individual person you're sharing it with. I'm not entirely clear on it. We haven't quite got our head around it.
I don't think anyone fully understands GDPR except for all the lawyers, but because that was something that came up as well during this, because something I had done with my questionnaire was I had taken people's email addresses and basically said, I may wish to contact people. If you consent to this, then provide your email address. And I was very clear about what I was going to use it for. So I've got a bunch of email addresses from people who participated and had consented to be contacted if I needed to. And then GDPR came in, and I've now got this data, and I would still like to contact some people to get some more information about some of their answers, but I don't know if that would be a breach of GDPR to do that. I think I don't think it would, because as well, I work at a college, and we sort of operate on the basis of if you have the data and you just use it as an email from yourself as a person to another person, then you're kind of covered and it's okay, but it's more like mass emails that are a problem. So I wouldn't be doing a mass email out to everyone, but still, I was sort of looking at it going, maybe I should contact people and say it's still okay, and then, because again, the software that I was using said, oh, we have GDPR support, and I looked at it and went, you have to pay for it. That's no good to me. But yeah, you can get anonymized data, and to be honest, even if you don't need specific data about con attendees, they can at the very least give you some ideas of numbers and operational things. And the offer to see the gender statistics for Minamicon was well before GDPR, so it wasn't so much of a problem then. Yes?
Like many people in the room, I'm really grateful that you did this. It's super interesting to get that insight. But what I thought was quite interesting, but most interesting, is when you compared it to the UK's sort of perhaps census data, the average for that. And you mentioned, I think, 2 or 3 things perhaps with those comparisons, but are there any more? Particularly, I think it could be quite funny as well. You say there's, higher average of this or this. Were there any that jumped out at you? Thought, oh, that's really interesting, and sort of confirmed a narrative within the fandom, or was really unusual?
Well, in terms of confirming the narrative within the fandom, I remember sitting in the reception at Minami 9, I think it was, and looking at the queue for the dealer's room and being struck by how many younger people and how many girls and people who did not clearly present either male or female were there. And it was such a stark change, because Minami 6 was my first Minamicon, and so I've been there, this was my 4th Minamicon, and yes, so it was striking, and that was sort of, like I say, that was the beginning of Pokemon. Pokemon was such a big force for getting people interested in it. And it's interesting as well that Pokemon was such a big thing, because before it came out here, there was controversy about Pokemon because of the epileptic seizures. I don't think the episode that caused the seizures in Japan ever got aired in the UK. I understand when... No. The Porygon, yeah. I understand that it got shown in America, but only after they aggressively slowed down the flashing. But yeah, so people were kind of already aware of it, and I remember, I can't remember who it was writing about it. It was some article or another, which basically the UK press had seized upon it, and it was like, well, now even Japan knows that their material is evil, kind of thing. But yeah, at the same time, so yeah, you're seeing the flows in, particularly with the age groups and the gender identity, and seeing where they overlap in terms of, particularly the sharp increase in the number of women in the 25 to 29-year-old group. That seemed very similar to, that felt right to me. I did actually have a look at census data a while ago, and unfortunately I can't remember what the figures were and how they compared to this. I was kind of looking through it to see if I could find some statistics for transgender numbers in the UK, and they don't exist in census data because they don't take that, so I had to look elsewhere for it. Unfortunately, there has been some estimates made. But yeah, for the most part, when I was looking through the data, a lot of it did ring true, but then you run into things like, wow, so many people got into it not isolated. Because I was actually quite isolated in the way that I got into anime, because I was just watching cartoons on TV, and Series Sister Girl came up and I loved it, and Ulysses 31 came up and I loved it. And I knew nothing more of anime until the late 90s, mid to late 90s, with the late license, and seeing random tapes being reviewed in games magazines I was buying at the time. But I was living in Ireland and no one knew anything about it. And so it was a very lonely thing for me. So discovering that Amecons existed, and that there were people in England who were fans, and that I could write to them, and I joined an all-girls fan club that existed in the early days, which is a great thing in and of itself, and something I'll be covering as part of my thesis, and which will also be in the book that I eventually write. But yeah, it wasn't until much later that the social thing came in for me, so for me it was very isolating. So it was quite nice to see just how social we are, and how influenced we are by other people around us bringing us in, rather than sort of just sitting and, on your own, discovering something and just sort of going, well, this is my thing now. Ooh, there are other people. Yes?
You mentioned you were collecting IP addresses for the purposes of geographic analysis.
I actually wasn't collecting IP addresses. The IP addresses were collected by the software that I was using.
Right.
And I really didn't look at the IP addresses at all. And literally all I used them for was, oh, that person's in America, delete.
Right. I was interested because obviously with an IP address you can usually get down to at least a city, or the nearest city to someone's location. I would be very interested to know if your sample was representative in its distribution across the UK of a population.
That's interesting. It's something I hadn't actually considered doing. So I've still got the data, I just haven't used it for anything. So it's something that I can look into. So yeah, thanks for that. Yes?
In the true and false section before, the 30 to 34 age group didn't really turn up. Was there anything notable about that in the true?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear that.
So the 30 to 34 age group didn't really turn up in the true and false. Was there anything notable about them at all?
God damn it, I wish I'd brought my... Actually, hang on. Through the powers of Google Docs, I can actually just get up my Minami one.
The fact that very little springs to mind suggests no, there really wasn't.
Hang on. A lot of this is very similar. Don't have seizures, please. So 30 to 34s, yes? Okay, nothing particularly spectacular there. Well, I mean, it's much the same. It's mostly male, very predominantly white, very close to the national average transgender identity, mostly straight, education. Yeah, so nearly half with bachelor's degrees and then 10% with master's degrees, so nothing spectacular there. So there's Pokemon beginning there. I don't think that really featured in the 35 to 39s. Legend of the Four Kings came up as one of the favourite series. Yeah, that was a very long manga video release. It was 12 episodes, which got dragged out terribly on the Channel 4 late license slot because Channel 4 was showing anime and it was manga video releases very late at night on Fridays. It was either Fridays or Saturday nights. Legend of the Four Kings, they showed about half of it and then they sort of decided to, they just stopped showing it until they sort of went, oh hang on, we need to fill 45 minutes, there we go. It surprised me that came up because I wouldn't consider that one of the absolute classics of the manga period. So it was interesting that it came up as one of the most popular series. And then Moomin as well, which was airing on TV, again in the kids' TV slot. So we've also got Card Capture Sakura there as well, and then obviously Pokemon. For the interesting geek-related, related geek subjects, gaming, sci-fi, and collectible card games. Something I did do with this was to sort of make note when people said I got into it because of this other thing. I made a note of what it was that was popular, and there was a little bit of shift there. So I think possibly this group was the only one that mentioned collectible card games. Oh, sorry, those are entry points, not popular ones. So most popular series. Yeah, it's a pretty standard list. What you would expect. Food and drink, most popular thing for them. Lots of people interested in history and culture. A lot of people like to, it's one of the things they said they liked about anime was about the comparison between Western and Japanese cultures. So that came up fairly standard. No, that's it. At Minami, I trolled the audience a little bit before I gave them the 25 to 29-year-old results, so that's what that was about. Yes?
Yeah, I was just going to say, given the sort of the relative nicheness of the subject and the lack of pre-existing research, when you were first proposing this, and indeed when you're talking to your supervisor about this, did you find sort of any opposition or difficulties with them sort of reviewing it and things?
Funnily enough, when I had initially proposed what was a PhD, it was actually more about reflections of Japanese identity in anime, and it kind of metamorphosed into the history of UK anime fandom. Apparently this is very standard for higher degrees. I mean, the issue, I guess, is that my supervisor specialises in British and American animation. So he's having to play catch up with me a little bit. One thing that's been really fortunate is that fan studies is a big thing now. Like it's a relatively new field of study, but it is growing. There is a conference which is held in the UK every year. There are other branches of the fan studies network in other countries. They're very active on Facebook. They have a very active website. The group is very supportive, and it's very easy to share information. So I mean, you can very easily, you know, if you're in the Facebook group, you can post and say, you know, does anyone have? Can anyone recommend any papers about the subject? And someone will be able to jump in and give you some advice. So I mean, it's been handy for my supervisor in that he doesn't have to kind of, I can just point him in the right direction, which I don't think is how it's meant to work. But yeah, it's I think he sometimes doesn't completely know what I'm talking about, but he's good at keeping up with me. So, yes.
We had a lot of stuff in the survey regarding sexuality, gender, and there wasn't any statistics that I saw on sort of relationship status. And I wondered if that was a decision that you made.
I didn't consider doing it, and I'm not sure how useful it would have been to ask. For one thing, I was wary about asking too many invasive questions. So I mean, you know, someone had said to me, well, did you ask about income brackets? And I was like, no, because I don't really see what the point of that is. And someone else had said, did you ask about how people obtain their anime? And given that some methods of obtaining anime are more legal than others, I didn't want to incriminate anyone. I mean, I guess one of the issues with relationship status is that it's too changeable. So I mean, it's entirely possible that you feel it out in 1 year and you're happily in a relationship, and then like by the time anyone has done anything with the data, that's completely changed, and everything else is kind of a little bit more fixed, with the exception of things like educational level. But yeah, it wasn't something I considered terribly important. I mean, it's something that the only thing I could see as being useful is seeing the statistics for people who have children and are bringing them to conventions, which would be an interesting thing to cover, but I think with that it would have to be a more focused study on people who I know have children and are bringing them up and introducing them to anime, so rather than having a sort of scattershot, questionnaire. Anyone else? Yeah?
I mean, it's one of the gaps that I kind of noticed, like the 30 to 35, like perhaps they don't have time to get engaged in fan education or something, because they might have young families.
Yeah.
So more energy goes into that, and then later on, when the children are older, they can then rededicate like their time to this. So
yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, this is a thing that I'm aware of and I've been aware of for quite some time. I mean, things change because as you get older, your priorities change, and there's no shame in sort of someone thinking, right, this is something I just don't have time for anymore, or it doesn't interest me anymore, or I need to step away from it. And I mean, there's a reason why there were a lot of people that I would have seen at every con in the early, in the 90s who you don't see anymore now, and it's because they've got other things going on in their life, and that's just what happens, and that's not a problem. It is something that I'm aware of. It's kind of difficult to measure for that, if you know what I mean. Without again like doing more detailed discussions with people, which is something that I could do since I have the data. Because is there a reason why you're not so much into cosplay kind of thing? And for the most part, it probably will be. I'm busy. Got 10 minutes. Any more questions? Yes?
Was there a consideration into asking questions about social class, or was that getting a bit too invasive?
I had a secondary supervisor who said to me at one point that every social analysis in Britain is about class. But it wasn't something that I thought to ask, mainly because I'm not really sure that it makes that much of a difference when we're here. Like, is there any sort of divide that people notice?
I might have thought you might have a stereotype of ways that maybe if you're lower class, you're more bound into traditional models of gender roles and all this,
I see what you mean.
which is kind of a bit weird, and might be a little bit less, and a little bit less, I suppose, when you spend on traditions.
I see your point, but again, it wasn't something I considered asking about. Firstly, because, like I say, I don't really see that there are many stark class divides in anime fandom, and also because, again, it's the whole kind of what do you define yourself as?
Yeah.
So I mean, I think technically I'm middle class because of my upbringing, but like where I am now, I don't know if I count as middle class. But equally, I don't think I count as working class, but I'm not middle class, so what am I, kind of thing? And it becomes a tricky thing to measure, and. I like not having that ambiguity with that one. Yes?
So just following up on the subject you were just saying about the class divide, I think the one where it does go up against your research? Is that the way you're classifying is active fandom? I mean,
That's a good point, yes.
I'm from out in the boonies of Northumberland with working class parents. Literally couldn't afford to travel to conventions until maybe 5 or 6 years ago. Because I'm decidedly middle class, but as to my parents' upbringing. I would have classed myself still as an active family participant, but I didn't have a university Amecon, I didn't travel to conventions. When I was in high school, up until end of university, I didn't actually have access to the internet at the time, so I didn't even know most of these conventions had been going on. And I suspect it's probably still the same for a lot of anime fans from my neck of the woods, because I mean, up in the northeast is like you've got SunnyCon once a year, and that's about it.
I mean, I think that did balance out a little bit when I opened it up to social media, because honestly, about half the responses that came through on the questionnaire were people who had discovered it through social media. So it became less closed then. So I think that would balance out a little bit. Something else that did come up was, when I asked people about what was your first con, what were your favourite cons, a lot of people were naming just the little local Comic-Con, which are worlds away from this kind of thing, but which nonetheless are very valuable to people who maybe can't travel down to London for MCM, because MCM, even though it is very easy to get into, still has a lot of expenses associated with it. So yeah, I mean, I didn't explicitly ask about class because it didn't really occur to me, and that is an excellent point, and I thank you for it. But I do think that it's sort of self-balanced a little bit. Thank you. Yes?
Sorry, will this be available to view online?
I can make this available online. Do you have Google Docs?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, what I did with Minami was to make a shareable version of the slides and put them up on a link in the Minamicon group. So I'll put up a link in the two social groups for Amecon.
So that Facebook has used
I can put it on my Twitter. The two social groups on Facebook are the unofficial Amecon social group and the Doki Doki Amecon Club one. So yeah, I'll put links up in both of those.
Thanks.
All right, one last question. Yes?
I don't know if it's relevant because of numbers of this, but you mentioned that you tried to keep it sort of con-specific and then went social media.
Yeah.
I don't know, were there any trends that you noticed before and after you put it on social media with regards to sort of certain answers to questions, or is that not really something?
None that I've noticed, but I wasn't really looking for that. I did get a couple of people who filled out the questionnaire who were anime fans but had never gone to a con. I was a little bit disheartened by that at the time, because I was like, well, I want to get an idea of people who go to cons. But I mean, especially in light of the point that you've made, not everyone can afford to go to cons, but it's a lot more affordable to pay for Netflix, and it's a lot more affordable to get on the internet and chat to people. So yes, I mean, I freely acknowledge that that the early approach was flawed, I do think that having the social media as a backup, did a lot to balance out the data. But I didn't look for any specific trends between pre-Facebook sharing and post-Facebook sharing. I mean, it's something that I could look at. It's just that I have so much data.
Forgive me. You'll also find a lot of anime fans who don't go to cons but are very active beyond just looking up things on Netflix, because they're doing what people used to do before Netflix was a thing, which is sharing anime, acquiring it online, joining up with local clubs, and that sort of small community-based activity.
Yeah. Okay, I'm pretty much out of time, so thank you again so much for coming. So I get my book written, I'll promote it heavily at Amecon, so you'll know all about it. Thank you again.